I have watched American presidents manage military crises for 3 decades. I have seen the measured responses, the carefully calibrated escalation ladders, the diplomatic off ramps constructed with precision to avoid the kind of direct confrontation that turns a regional conflict into something the entire world pays for. I have watched administrations navigate the space between credibility and catastrophe with varying degrees of skill and varying degrees of success. But I have never, in 30 years of watching this, seen an American president wake up to the news that 4 United States Navy destroyers have been sunk in a single engagement. 1,200 American sailors are dead or missing, and the nation responsible has already announced it will do it again. If the response crosses a threshold it has unilaterally defined, that is the situation Donald Trump faced this morning. And the response, he has ordered the full mobilization of American retaliatory capability across every available domain, has set a clock running over the Strait of Hormuz and the broader Middle East that is now measured not in days, but in hours. Here is what happened. At 11:47 p.m. local time, Iranian Aerospace Force and IRGC naval units launched a coordinated strike package of 300 missiles, a combination of Khalij-Fars anti-ship ballistic missiles, Nur anti-ship cruise missiles, and Fatah, 2 hypersonic glide vehicles against the American destroyer squadron operating in the waters between Jask Island and the entrance to the Strait of Hormuz. The USS Gravely, the USS Nitsey, the USS Mason, and the USS Forrest Sherman were operating in a patrol configuration that had become routine over the preceding weeks, a presence mission designed to signal American commitment to freedom of navigation through the world's most strategically critical maritime chokepoint. That routine became a catastrophe in under 20 minutes. The strike package was designed with a sophistication that the American naval tactical community will be studying and debating for years. The Khalij-Fars ballistic missiles, traveling at hypersonic velocities in their terminal phase, arrived first, saturating the standard missile defensive systems of all 4 destroyers simultaneously. The Nur cruise missiles, flying at low altitude on terrain masking approach profiles, arrived in the gaps created by the ballistic missile saturation, targeting the surviving defensive systems that had expended interceptors against the first wave. The Fatah, 2 hypersonic glide vehicles, maneuvering in their terminal phase in ways that defeated every remaining intercept attempt, completed the engagement sequence. All 4 destroyers were struck by multiple weapons. All 4 were assessed as total losses within 40 minutes of the first impact. The waters off Jask Island became, in those 40 minutes, the site of the worst single engagement loss of American naval assets since the Second World War. Trump's response was immediate, personal, and operationally unambiguous. Within 2 hours of receiving the damage assessment, he authorized the full mobilization of American retaliatory capability and issued a public statement that left no room for diplomatic interpretation. The Middle East is now hours away from the most consequential military confrontation since the Gulf War. And the question that every government on earth is urgently asking, whether the American response can achieve its objectives without triggering consequences that spiral beyond anyone's ability to control, has no comfortable answer. In the next 35 minutes, we are going to work through the questions that define this moment. How did 300 Iranian missiles defeat the most sophisticated naval air defense systems in the world and send 4 American destroyers to the bottom of the Gulf of Oman? And what does the specific technical execution of that engagement reveal about Iranian anti-ship warfare capability that the Pentagon had catastrophically underestimated? What does Trump's full retaliation order actually mean in operational terms? What assets are being mobilized? What targets are being designated? And what are the escalation thresholds that separate a contained military exchange from a regional war that the global economy cannot survive? Why is the Strait of Hormuz and Iran's demonstrated willingness to turn it into a kill zone the variable that makes every American escalation option more dangerous than any administration war game has, honestly. Acknowledged. And when the retaliatory strikes begin and Iran responds, as it has already promised to respond, where does this end, and who, if anyone, is positioned to stop it before it reaches the point of no return? If you have been following this conflict and looking for analysis that goes past the political noise and into the operational reality that will determine the outcome, subscribe now and stay with me through this full breakdown. Hit like, share this with anyone who understands that what happens in the next 48 hours will reshape the world they live in, and leave your assessment in the comments. I read every one of them. Now let us work through this completely. Part 1, 300 missiles, 4 destroyers, 20 minutes, the anatomy of a naval catastrophe. From a professional standpoint, the strike that Iran executed against the American destroyer squadron off Jask Island represents the most sophisticated anti-ship engagement in the history of modern naval warfare. I do not use that characterization lightly, and I want to work through precisely why it earns that description, because understanding how 4 Arleigh Burke-class destroyers were sunk in under 20 minutes requires understanding both the technical sophistication of what Iran employed and the specific vulnerabilities in American naval air defense architecture that the engagement ruthlessly exploited. The Arleigh Burke-class destroyer is the backbone of American naval air defense. Its Aegis combat system, the most capable shipborne air defense architecture ever deployed, integrates AN, Spy-1 radar, standard missile interceptors, and a combat management system that can simultaneously track and engage multiple targets across a wide range of threat categories. In any honest assessment of naval capability, the Arleigh Burke represents the gold standard of surface ship air defense. 4 of them, operating in a coordinated formation with overlapping radar coverage and shared targeting data through Link 16 communications, constitute an air defense umbrella that no single category threat can reliably defeat. Iran's operational planners understood this. They designed a strike package that was specifically engineered not to defeat Aegis in a fair fight, because no fair fight against Aegis produces the outcome Iran required, but to defeat it by simultaneously presenting threat categories across the full spectrum of engagement difficulty in a volume and sequencing that exhausted its interceptor capacity before the most dangerous weapons arrived. The opening salvo of 120 College Fars anti-ship ballistic missiles was the forcing move. The College Fars is a maneuvering re-entry vehicle specifically designed for anti-ship employment. It acquires and tracks surface vessels in its terminal phase, adjusting its trajectory to compensate for target movement. At hypersonic terminal velocities, it presents an interception geometry that pushes the Standard Missile SM-3 to the edge of its performance envelope. 4 destroyers with a combined SM-3 inventory of approximately 80 rounds were presented with 120 incoming ballistic threats simultaneously. The mathematics of that exchange, 80 interceptors against 120 targets, with each engagement requiring targeting radar time, interceptor flight time, and kill assessment before the next engagement can be initiated, produced an inevitable outcome. The SM-3 inventory was exhausted before all 120 ballistic threats had been engaged into the gaps created by that SM-3 exhaustion. The second wave of 110 Noor anti-ship cruise missiles arrived at low altitude. The Noor, Iran's domestically produced variant of the Chinese C-802 flies. Its terminal approach at altitudes between 5 and 10 meters above sea level, using sea-skimming flight to stay below the radar horizon of defending ships until it is within a range that provides minimal intercept preparation time. Against SM two-point defense systems operating under the cognitive load of simultaneously managing the ballistic threat engagement, the sea-skimming cruise missiles presented an engagement geometry that overwhelmed the remaining defensive capacity. SM-2 interceptors were expended against the Noor salvo, further depleting the defensive inventory. The third wave, 70 Fata, two hypersonic glide vehicles arriving in the terminal phase of the engagement sequence, found four destroyers with severely depleted interceptor inventories, degraded defensive system performance from the continuous engagement tempo of the preceding waves, and combat management computers operating at the ceiling of their processing capacity. The Fatah II's maneuvering terminal phase defeated the remaining SM-6 intercept attempts. Multiple weapons struck each vessel. The fires, the flooding, and the catastrophic structural damage that resulted from multiple hypersonic warhead impacts against vessels whose defensive systems had been deliberately exhausted before the most lethal weapons arrived, produced 4 total losses in under 20 minutes. The operational lesson stated plainly is that the layered saturation approach to anti-ship warfare, when executed with sufficient volume across sufficient threat categories, can defeat even the most capable shipborne air defense system available. The American naval establishment knew this theoretically. Jask Island has proven it operationally. Part 2, Trump's retaliation order, what full mobilization actually means. When Donald Trump uses the phrase full retaliation in the context of 1,200 American sailors dead or missing and 4 destroyers on the seabed, the operational content of that phrase is not rhetorical. Having observed American military planning culture closely, I can tell you that the targeting packages, force deployment orders, and escalation authorities, that the phrase full retaliation translates into represent a level of military action against Iran that would be the most extensive direct American strike campaign against a regional power since the invasion of Iraq in 2003. The immediate force mobilization picture is already publicly visible in its broad outlines. 3 carrier strike groups, the USS Gerald R. Ford, the USS Dwight D. Eisenhower, and the USS Harry S. Truman, have been ordered to converge on the Gulf of Oman and Arabian Sea operating areas. The combined air wing capacity of those 3 carriers represents approximately 250 strike aircraft capable of generating sustained sortie rates against Iranian targets that no Iranian air defense system can fully absorb. B. 2 Spirit stealth bombers have been recalled from their home bases to forward staging locations within strike range of Iranian territory, a deployment that signals the intention to employ deep penetrating munitions against hardened underground targets that conventional aircraft cannot reliably defeat. Submarine-launched Tomahawk cruise missile packages have been pre-positioned against a target list that American intelligence has been maintaining and updating for years. The target set that American planners have developed against Iran is extensive and reflects years of intelligence collection against Iranian military infrastructure, Iranian air defense systems, the S-300 batteries, and the indigenous Bavar 373 systems that protect Iranian airspace are the first priority targets, because suppressing Iranian air defenses is the prerequisite for the sustained air campaign that follows. Iranian ballistic missile production facilities, the underground complexes where the weapons that sank 4 American destroyers are manufactured, are high priority targets whose destruction would degrade future Iranian strike capability. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy bases along the Makran coast, the facilities from which the Jask Island strike was launched and coordinated, are priority targets whose destruction would reduce Iran's ability to repeat the operation. And the nuclear infrastructure that has been the underlying motivation for the American-Iranian confrontation for 2 decades is on every target list that any serious American war planner has ever developed. What Trump's full retaliation order does not include, and this is the operationally significant omission, is a defined end state. The order specifies what American forces are authorized to strike. It does not specify what outcome those strikes are intended to produce, or what Iranian response to those strikes would be considered acceptable versus what Iranian response would trigger further American escalation. That ambiguity is not an oversight. It reflects the genuine strategic difficulty of defining achievable objectives in a military confrontation with Iran that any honest assessment must acknowledge. Destroying Iranian military infrastructure does not eliminate Iranian military capability, because Iranian military capability is distributed, hardened, and in significant proportion located in underground facilities specifically designed to survive the kind of air campaign that American forces are preparing to execute. Destroying Iranian nuclear infrastructure may set the program back by years, but does not eliminate the knowledge, the personnel, or the institutional commitment that drives it. And any American strike campaign that kills Iranian military personnel and destroys Iranian infrastructure will produce an Iranian response, the nature, scale, and targeting of which will be determined by Tehran's own escalation calculus, which no American war game has reliably predicted. Part 3, the Hormuz variable, why every American option carries catastrophic risk. I want to be direct about something that the political discussion surrounding Trump's retaliation order has consistently avoided, stating plainly, every American military option available in this situation carries a risk of triggering consequences that dwarf the original provocation in their global economic impact. The variable that makes this true, the variable that transforms a serious bilateral military confrontation into a potential civilizational economic event, is the Strait of Hormuz. 21 million barrels of oil pass through the Strait of Hormuz every day. Approximately 1/3 of the world's liquefied natural gas transits the same choke point. The economies of Japan, South Korea, China, India, and every major European nation are linked to the continued flow of energy through those 21 miles of water between the Iranian coast and the Omani Peninsula. When that flow is interrupted, not reduced, not threatened, but physically interrupted by the kind of sustained mining, missile, and naval interdiction campaign that Iran has both the capability and the demonstrated will to execute, the global economic consequences begin within 72 hours and accelerate to levels that no government economic model has seriously prepared for. Iran's ability to close the Strait of Hormuz in response to American military action is not theoretical, it is operational. The Iranian naval and aerospace assets positioned along the Makran coast and on the islands within the strait, Abu Musa, the Tums, and the network of hardened coastal facilities that have been built specifically for strait interdiction operations constitute a layered anti-access capability that American naval forces cannot rapidly suppress without a sustained campaign that itself carries escalation risks. Minefields can be laid faster than they can be swept. Coastal missile batteries can be destroyed, but replacement systems can be brought forward from inland positions. Fast attack craft can be sunk, but their replacements can be launched from hardened coastal shelters. The Strait of Hormuz is Iran's strategic leverage over the global economy, and any American military action that threatens the Iranian regime's survival will trigger its use. The oil price mathematics of a Hormuz closure are straightforward and terrifying. At current global demand levels, a one-week interruption of Hormuz transit would produce oil price increases that analyst models suggest could reach $200 to $300 per barrel from a current baseline in the $80 to $90 range. A sustained closure of 2 weeks or more would produce supply shortages in Asian importing economies that cannot be compensated for through strategic reserve releases on the required scale. The inflationary, recessionary, and social stability consequences of that price shock would be felt in every economy on Earth, with the most severe impacts in the developing nations that have the least capacity to absorb energy cost increases. Trump's political calculation in ordering full retaliation is understandable. From a domestic American perspective, 1,200 dead sailors and 4 sunken destroyers demand a response that is visibly proportionate to the provocation. But the strategic calculation that underlies that political logic must account for the Hormuz variable in ways that the public retaliation order does not acknowledge. The American response that satisfies the domestic political requirement may trigger the Iranian response that produces the global economic catastrophe. Managing that tension between what the domestic political situation demands and what the strategic situation can absorb is the most consequential challenge any American president has faced since the Cuban Missile Crisis. And unlike Kennedy in 1962, Trump is managing it in a media environment that provides no space for the quiet back-channel diplomacy that ultimately resolved that confrontation. Part 4, David against Goliath, Why Iran Does Not Blink. What I find most operationally significant about Iran's behavior in the hours since the Jask Island strike, and this is a dimension that the Western media coverage has almost entirely missed, is the absence of any signal suggesting that the prospect of American retaliation is producing the kind of strategic recalculation that American deterrence theory predicts it should produce. There has been no back-channel communication indicating willingness to negotiate. There has been no reduction in operational tempo, suggesting that Iranian forces are standing down in anticipation of a diplomatic resolution. There has been instead a public statement from IRGC leadership that explicitly acknowledges the American retaliation as expected, characterizes it as acceptable within Iran's strategic framework, and promises a response to that retaliation that Iran's spokespeople described as disproportionate by design. This behavioral pattern, the absence of deterrence effect in the face of explicit American military threat, is not irrational. It reflects a strategic calculation that is internally coherent once you understand the framework within which Iranian decision makers are operating. Iran did not sink 4 American destroyers because its leadership miscalculated the American response. It sank them because its leadership concluded that the American response, including the full retaliation that Trump has now ordered, is a cost that Iran can absorb. While the strategic benefits of demonstrating that American naval power can be defeated in a direct engagement outweigh that cost by a margin that the current moment made worth paying. That calculation rests on 3 foundational assessments that Iranian strategic planners have been developing and refining for years. The first is that American military action against Iran, regardless of its scale and destructiveness, cannot produce the regime change outcome that would eliminate the Iranian threat because the social, political, and institutional foundations of the Iranian state are more resilient than American planners have consistently assumed. The second is that Iranian retaliatory capability, including the Hormuz closure option, imposes costs on American escalation that constrain how far the response can practically go before the global economic consequences become politically unsustainable in Washington. The third is that the international political environment, Russia and China providing diplomatic cover, the developing world providing moral support, and the domestic American political debate providing structural constraints on open-ended military commitment, limits the duration and intensity of any American military campaign in ways that Iran's own staying power can outlast. The will that sustains this strategic framework, the institutional conviction that the cost of resistance is worth paying because the alternative is a permanent subordination of Iranian sovereignty to external preferences, was not manufactured by the current leadership. It was forged over 50 years of external pressure that consistently produced the opposite of its intended effect. Every sanction that failed to produce compliance, every assassination that failed to break the program, every military threat that failed to produce strategic concession, added another layer to an institutional conviction that external pressure is a problem to be solved rather than a condition to be accepted. The 4 American destroyers on the seabed off Jask Island are the operational expression of that conviction at its most consequential. Part 5. The Precipice, what the world looks like on the other side of this night. My honest assessment, and I want to state this as clearly as professional responsibility allows, is that the next 48 hours represent the most dangerous window in the Middle East since the Yom Kippur War of 1973. Not the most dangerous window in terms of the military balance between the immediate combatants, but the most dangerous window in terms of the range of outcomes that could emerge from the decisions being made right now in Washington, Tehran, Moscow, Beijing, and the capitals of every nation whose energy security depends on the continued flow of oil through the Strait of Hormuz. The optimistic scenario, the scenario in which American strikes degrade Iranian military capability sufficiently to satisfy the domestic political requirement of visible retaliation. Iran absorbs those strikes without triggering the Hormuz closure, and back-channel communication produces a de-escalation framework that neither side publicly acknowledges, requires a degree of mutual restraint and tacit coordination between adversaries who are simultaneously killing each other's personnel and destroying each other's infrastructure. That scenario is not impossible. History contains examples of adversaries managing escalation under conditions that appeared to preclude restraint. But it requires that both sides simultaneously calculate that the cost of continued escalation exceeds the benefit and the signals currently emanating from both Washington and Tehran suggests that neither side has reached that calculation yet. In Moscow, the response to the Jask Island strike and the American retaliation order has been calibrated to the millimeter public calls for restraint, delivered with the tone of a party that is privately satisfied with how events are developing. Russia bears no direct cost from a military confrontation between the United States and Iran. It benefits from the diversion of American attention and resources. It benefits from the oil price increase that a Hormuz disruption would produce, given Russia's own hydrocarbon export revenues. And it benefits from every demonstration that American military power has operational limits that a determined regional adversary with capable weapons can exploit. The Kremlin is not going to provide the off-ramp that prevents this escalation. It has no incentive to do so. In Beijing, the calculation is more complex and more consequential. China is the largest single importer of Gulf oil. Approximately 40% of its oil imports transit the Strait of Hormuz. A Hormuz closure does not benefit China in the way it benefits Russia. It imposes costs on China that are severe enough to constitute a genuine strategic concern. But China's ability to influence the immediate situation is limited by the same dynamic that has characterized its Middle East posture throughout this conflict. It can call for restraint, it can offer mediation, but it cannot compel either side to accept terms that their own strategic calculations have led them to reject. Chinese diplomatic influence in this crisis is real, but insufficient to the scale of the problem for the world that exists on the other side of the next 48 hours, whatever that world looks like. The permanent strategic legacy of the Jask Island engagement is already established, regardless of how the immediate crisis resolves. 4 American destroyers have been sunk in a direct engagement with Iranian forces. That fact cannot be undiplomaticized, cannot be strategically reframed, and cannot be absorbed by the American security establishment without producing a fundamental reassessment of the naval force posture, the anti-ship missile defense architecture, and the strategic assumptions that place those 4 ships in the engagement envelope of 300 Iranian missiles without adequate protection against the specific threat combination that destroyed them. The Middle East that exists after this night is not the Middle East that existed before it. The assumption of American naval invulnerability, the foundational premise of American power projection in the region for 3 generations, has been operationally defeated. The deterrence architecture built on that premise requires reconstruction from its foundations. And the reconstruction will happen in a strategic environment that is being permanently altered by the demonstration that a self-reliant regional power with precision anti-ship weapons, the operational will to use them, and the strategic patience to wait for the right moment can defeat the world's most powerful navy in a direct engagement on terms entirely of its own choosing. 4 destroyers, 300 missiles, 20 minutes, 1,200 sailors. Those are the numbers that define what happened off Jask Island. They are also the numbers that have set in motion a chain of events whose endpoint no one, not in Washington, not in Tehran, not in Moscow or Beijing, can predict with confidence. Trump has ordered full retaliation. Iran has promised a disproportionate response to that retaliation. The Strait of Hormuz, the energy lifeline of the global economy, sits at the center of a military confrontation that neither side has yet shown any inclination to step back from. I have spent 30 years analyzing how military confrontations escalate and how they de-escalate. And the honest conclusion I draw from everything I can observe about this situation is that the de-escalation pathway is narrow, requires simultaneous good faith from adversaries who are currently killing each other, and depends on external actors, China most critically, whose interests are not fully aligned with the outcome that de-escalation would produce. The escalation pathway is wide, requires only that one side makes the decision that the other side's last action crossed a threshold that demands a response, that the responding side's own threshold calculations cannot absorb without further escalation. The Middle East has hours left before the American retaliation begins. What those hours produce, whether a back-channel communication creates the space for a managed de-escalation, or whether the domestic political imperatives on both sides drive the confrontation past the point where management is possible, will determine whether the world economy survives this crisis intact or pays a price for it, measured in years of disruption. What is your assessment? Can Trump's retaliation achieve its objectives without triggering the Hormuz closure that turns a regional military crisis into a global economic catastrophe? Or has this confrontation already crossed the threshold where escalation is the only trajectory available to both sides? Leave your analysis in the comments. This is the conversation that matters most right now, and I read every response. If this breakdown delivered the depth and honesty this moment demands, share it, hit like, and subscribe. The next update will be out the moment the situation develops. Stay with me.